Morning, everyone. Want to welcome all of you to our day 3, the final day of this forum. We've had some great presentations, a lot of interesting ideas, and now we're going to listen to what I heard from 5 people and what they didn't hear. And Chris Potter is going to be co-moderating this with me. Let me give you 2 of the things that I heard. I heard Controller Yee and Mark Gold say unequivocally, "We will use the best science in determining the fates of California's offshore oil platforms. Whether you leave them intact, remove them entirely, partially remove them, repurpose them, etc." I also heard, though, later in the day, from state officials that current state laws and policies make it virtually impossible to use the best science in making a decision because the options are seriously constrained in California. I also heard that each platform is unique, so a one-size-all policy doesn't make any sense, but current state laws, regulations, and policies constrain flexibility in choosing the best option. So this morning, we're going to have 5 people. They will come to the podium one by one, make some brief comments, what they heard and what they didn't hear. Then they will go to sit in the front row until all 5 have spoken, and then we will bring them up on stage, and we can have some Q&A. And we want to hear from all of you what you heard and what you didn't hear, because there's an awful lot of expertise in this theater that we have not yet heard from. So, Chris, I'm going to let you make a few comments, and then we'll bring up our first speaker.
Thank you, Jerry. I really don't have much to add to to the points that Jerry just made, but I guess I would like to thank the Aquarium again for co-hosting this event with the state. I think this is really the beginning of a dialogue around decommissioning. I mean, it's been 20 years since the state and the federal agencies hosted a similar event. It's clear that we're on the cusp of decommissioning, and where it's going to lead us is not yet clear. With that, I'd like to invite Jennifer Lucchesi up to make her comments about her reflections on the last couple days. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all. I'm Jennifer Lucchesi. I'm the Executive Officer of the California State Lands Commission. I want to first express gratitude to the Tongva people whose lands we sit this morning and who have fished in these coastal waters for countless generations. I think it's important for us to acknowledge our tribal lands and our tribal history every chance we get, especially as we lead into this very robust conversation about decommissioning and reconnecting, as Dr. Earl said last night, with our ocean and our ocean resources. Over the last couple days, I've been blown away about the amount of knowledge and expertise and perspectives that we have heard through the formal presentations, the Q&A, and the informal conversations that we've had between sessions. I don't think there's any doubt that the folks in this room and all of our colleagues and friends and partners that we work every day with on issues of marine and coastal protection, that we don't have the brain power and the curiosity and the fortitude to make smart decisions about what our coastal waters are going to look like in the future, especially as we transition away from our current energy production, fossil fuel dependent and nuclear power. I think the controller mentioned this, in her brief comments the other night. It's not just the significant amount of infrastructure that we're going to have to deal with in state and federal waters associated with offshore platforms and offshore oil and gas infrastructure, but we're also working through decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear generating station down in San Diego County, and of course planning the decommissioning for the Diablo Canyon power plant in San Luis Obispo County. These are huge transitions of our energy production, and it's going to leave a significant amount of infrastructure in our marine waters, in our coastal zone, and trying to figure out what to do with that is obviously a significant part of all of our jobs, and the approach and the methodology that we work through to make those decisions is critically important. As I listened to all the sessions over the last couple days, it made me think about something that's near and dear to our hearts at the State Lands Commission, which is the public trust doctrine. Seth talked a little bit about the decision-making framework that our commission goes through when making decisions about the use and development of our lands and resources, and that those decisions need to be in the best interest of the state. But it's also equally or even more so under the umbrella of the common law public trust doctrine. And in fact, the California Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Game Code, the Coastal Act are all expressions of that responsibility under the public trust doctrine for the state and the people to manage these lands and resources for future generations. This is the foundational principle upon which we manage our coastal zone or coastal assets through the lens of. It dates back to Justinian era where the sea and the rivers and the ocean are common to all people, and they are all of our assets, all of our resources, and we should be managing them as that. And what I think is so critical about the public trust doctrine as a common law doctrine is that it is framed and the pillars are really set in decisions that the courts have made over the years. But that's not the beauty of the public trust doctrine. The beauty is that it's actually very forward-thinking, and it's based on societal values. What we as a community, what we value in our ocean, what we value in our natural resources, and it's actually very, there's a lot of responsibility that's placed on government, on the legislature, on all of us to really reflect and identify what values we want to preserve in our waters, in our coastal resources, and make decisions based on those values. And so necessarily as a common law doctrine, courts are, court decisions are looking at the past, right? And adjudicating whether those were proper decisions to be made about land use decisions or resource management decisions. But the doctrine is an evolving doctrine. It's not static, and it changes as society's needs and values change. Prime example, back in the early 1900s, what California valued at the time was mineral extraction, oil and gas extraction for energy production. Over the years, particularly in the 70s and 80s, the value system changed, and that happened for a number of reasons, but there was more value placed on making sure that we were protecting our natural resources. I think this is a very great framework for how we look at decommissioning. And we didn't really talk about that directly over the last couple of days, but you could infer and glean from all the different speakers who were talking about what their value system was, whether it's fishing, protecting our natural resources, restoring our ocean to what it was before the platforms were in place, jobs, community, local government, all of those are expressions of values. And I think that as we move forward and start really getting into the weeds and the trenches about the best available science, the analytical and the methodology that we use for analyzing what the best alternatives are out there, that we also have to, both individually, as government, and as all of our stakeholders, really have to reflect upon what our values are, what we want to see our future to be with, and our connection with the ocean, as Dr. Earl talked about last night, and be very honest in our conversations, because these are complex issues, and when we start from a place of my position is X, we necessarily go into a binary choice. And as we all know, as we've all lived in and worked in the ocean space, Nothing is as complex as the ocean, and nothing is as complex as our society and how we value our connection with the ocean. And so I really, in terms of a takeaway, and that I've been thinking a lot about from these last couple days as we begin the discussion and the dialogue, is that we all take a moment to reflect on what our own value system is, what we want for our families, what we want for our community, and that we approach these discussions from a place of mutual respect and mutual learning. And I think this goes to a couple of presentations that were yesterday that really looked at lessons learned, both internationally, nationally, and of course in our own state waters. There is a tremendous amount of information that we can learn from our past actions, through the lens of what went right, what went wrong, and how do we move forward with that information. And even more so, going back and really seeking to understand and learn from our tribal governments, whose connection with the ocean and with our natural resources is so genuine and true. And I felt over the course of the last day or so that with all the speakers, we were trying through our own lens of values is get back to what that connection was, what that means to us personally. And so that's one of the takeaways, is really seeking to understand, mutual respect, listening, and trying to find common ground as we move forward in the analysis and methodology and work that we need to put into understanding what the different alternatives are for decommissioning and what we want to see in our ocean. And finally, just to close out, I do feel it's a huge responsibility of the state, of all of us state government, state agencies. We come from a place of public service. We're here to serve and work for the people of California. And part of that is making sure that we articulate and explain to the best of our ability the different authorities and jurisdictions, the different laws that are in place here, and really help all of our stakeholders understand the framework by which we're operating in. Over the last number of years, and especially with the Newsom administration, the expectation is that we work together and we coordinate, and to the extent we can, respecting our different authorities and jurisdiction, we speak with one voice. We owe that to the people of California, and I think that as one state agency, that is something that we are committed to, especially because of the different frameworks, legal frameworks, statutory frameworks associated with state water decommissioning versus OCS decommissioning. And we heard a little bit about the differences and the similarities and the confusion in our panel last night. And so that's really incumbent on us state agencies to serve all of you and all of the public in a way that helps all of us advance the conversation. And so with that, I'll conclude my remarks. I really look forward to answering any questions and hearing your thoughts on what all of you learned over the last couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next, I'd like to invite up Cassidy Teufel from the Coastal Commission.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief to make sure to leave space for my esteemed colleagues on this panel. But I appreciate being here, as well as all the excellent presentations yesterday and last night. During the presentations, I was taking notes and wanted to highlight a couple of the kind of take-home messages or kind of key things that I heard. Throughout the day, both during the presentations as well as during the comments and questions that came from the audience, I certainly heard a strong interest in recognizing the ecological contribution of these platform structures and a desire to fully consider if and how that contribution could be protected. At the same time, I also heard a variety of significant legal and policy constraints to not fully removing the platforms, as well as technical and procedural constraints in doing that. I heard of a variety of the engineering and logistical challenges. I think John Smith outlined those fairly well in describing how these structures are some of the largest man-made structures on the planet, and their age and presence, location within the open ocean presents some really significant challenges to removing them. At the same time, I heard from our colleagues in the North Sea about the successful operations in doing that removal and in removing structures of this similar scale and magnitude in equally challenging locations, as well as some of the recent tools and techniques and equipment that's been developed to carry out that work. I heard the need for robust stakeholder engagement. I think Jennifer was just describing that as part of this. The Coastal Commission is another state agency. It's really our responsibility to make sure that we're serving that role as front-facing to the public and able to answer those questions and make sure the public is adequately educated and understands the processes so they can engage. That need for stakeholder engagement was reinforced with the need for tribal consultations and outreach to environmental justice communities particularly. I heard Angela Mooney-Darcy as challenged to disrupt the status quo and find better ways to engage with tribal nations, and I certainly take that on. I learned more about the fish and marine life that are found on and around the platform jackets, the variability between the fish and marine life communities amongst platforms, and as well as the need to preserve exclusion zones if those communities are to be protected. And so that's something to add to the mix as we consider ways moving forward with a variety of options for removal or protecting in place. And finally, I heard and was inspired by the great deal of enthusiasm and optimism for creative problem solving, creative solution seeking, and the need for ongoing conversations and continued public engagement as planning for this next round of decommissioning proceeds. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. Next, we have John Zorovich. John is the Deputy Director of the Energy Division at Santa Barbara County Planning.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. I thought this was a great discussion, something that really focused on some of the issues, called them out, identified some, and perhaps identified ones we haven't still thought of. I like the way the presentations and this forum was outlined. We started out with a discussion of how we have this aging infrastructure in the channel and down here in Southern California, and that the resources are really depleting, and that now's the time to really focus on what it is and what's going to be involved in the decommissioning efforts. The discussions we had about where it's occurred here in the channel, elsewhere in the coast, internationally, I found that very interesting because there's obviously been some successes and opportunities for improvements in those areas. And I thought that was something that was important to hear now and important to carry forward. And I think really too, what I also heard was important was that obviously these platforms provide ecological benefits, as we've heard, and that the policies right now and the science maybe is really not really thoroughly looking at what those benefits are and supporting some of that. And so moving forward, it'd be interesting to see what, if any, changes could be addressed in the legislation or other opportunities. Maybe it's not oil companies, but other third parties that take some of these over, fourth parties that insure it. I don't know. It was identified yesterday, and I thought that was an interesting concept. How that will play out, I'm not sure, but I think that would be something to look to. Santa Barbara County, certainly we in the county have seen the benefits as far as jobs and increased taxes in the area, but we've also seen the other side of it as far as oil spills and the effects it has on our economy. And so the decommissioning of offshore platforms is not relevant to us in the land use side because we don't really have yet jurisdiction in that area. But certainly as this project goes forward, we will be a key player and a player at the table when it comes to permitting with regards to the pipelines and onshore facilities that support these offshore platforms going forward, and looking at the decommissioning and the efforts that are going to be required and the permitting options, and looking to see, okay, what are those facilities? We too are looking at some of these and seeing, hey, what are some of the opportunities for the county? Some of these have facilities that include desal plants in areas where there's no water resources, or water resources are low. So for us, even in the county, in the land use side, it brings to us some additional opportunities to seek and see what may be reuses for some of these facilities. And so in watching what's going on the offshore, it also translates onto the local county planning departments as well. Moving forward, certainly, I think the partnership and the stakeholders that they've spoken to is really going to be important. I think the State Lands Commission particularly is to be commended. They've had multiple public outreaches for platform Holly and the pier decommissioning, and I'd further encourage that. I think the community likes that. And I know anytime oil and gas issues come before our county decision makers, there's still a very strong vocal presence there. And that I see these issues that we discussed today, as well as the ones on the land use side, are going to carry forward and are important for Santa Barbara County, as well as the entire state. And I think it's really something that's, again, it's really important that we're talking about it now, and rather than waiting and looking at what options we have, and then as we move forward through planning and doing the best job we can, I think this is really a good opportunity. And moving forward, I think I'd also like to see, while this was a great discussion here, you know, some of the effects and impacts are going to be closer to Ventura, Santa Barbara County. So if we move forward, it would be nice, I think, to have a forum or something like this. I know there was access on the web for people to monitor this, but I think it'd be a great opportunity to make it affordable for people can attend, and someplace closer to where we're actually going to see some of these things. That would be great too, and I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next, I'd like to invite up Don Kent. He's the president and CEO of Hub SeaWorld Research Institute.
Thank you, Chris. I'm used to having slides, and Jerry said I couldn't have any slides, and so I've been listening and typing for the last day and a half to try to come up with some ideas I could share with all of you, and I think I'll just try to reflect on some of what I heard. I'm reticent to function as an advocate because my training in science is really about problem solving. Let's go out and take a look at what's out there, analyze the problem, and come up with a solution. And back to what Jennifer was saying, we want to use the best science available, but there is that component to decision making in a public sense that maybe the best science isn't what people want, or they want to use that and then make their own decision based on their gut level feeling, and that's what a democracy is like. And so scientists don't rule the world yet, but we're getting there. And really the idea of rig streets, in all fairness, I also serve as the voluntary chair of the California Artificial Reef Enhancement Foundation, which has been working for about 20 years to educate the public about the work that goes on. I think Ann mentioned yesterday that we did a minor amount of funding to help them support the research that she reported on. So I'd like to just recount some of the things that I heard that kind of stood out to me as a scientist. I heard that the abundance of life under these platforms that has developed over the decades, such that the populations of fish and invertebrates resident there are greater in abundance than in any other observed natural reef. I think the number Jeremy reported was something like 27 times the density of weight per unit area that was observed in any other type of natural reef system. I heard that the recovery for some of the diminished populations of rockfish like Boccaccio, 20% of the capacity of those populations to recover, 20% of the fish that are needed for those populations to recover, which range all the way from Alaska down into Mexico, exist under, I think it was just 13 of these platforms. And I heard that the question of attraction versus production was really put to rest here with the research that's been done in collaboration between the National Marine Fisheries Service, the University of California, and the USGS. And some of the work that's been co-published by investigators in these three agencies, I think, are really represent the strongest basis for understanding that these are opportunistic structures for animals. They don't draw animals off of other reef structure. Rather, they provide a unique habitat that's three-dimensional in scope, that creates that very dense living situation and allows the larval forms of many different types of marine life to settle and thrive in these habitats. I believe these rigs are acting as de facto marine protection areas. It was mentioned there's a 500-meter area around them where it's a no activity zone, no fishing. I think Tom Raftigan was talking about how great it is if you can back up to one of these things and catch the fish that are on them. And it seems odd to me that we spent so much time and money and political effort to create marine protected areas. I think the number was 16 of them along the coastline that are exclusion zones for different types of fishing. And yet now we have over 20 of them that actually function as marine protected areas that are, all the science is telling us they're extremely valuable, extremely effective. And the idea that we would actually lose those in lieu of trying to create that situation in another location seems odd to me. I actually had the opportunity of diving on Edith right off the coast here. I think she's about 8 miles out. And I've been diving for over 40 years in Southern California. And I've had the pleasure of getting to dive in the Barrier Reef and other parts of the world. And I have to tell you that that was the most extraordinary dive of my life. I'd never been astounded by the amount of life that's under there, the abundance and the diversity, and the unique way that the animals have adapted. Bottom-dwelling fish that are up on the rig, living 90 feet off the ocean floor, but they're living on habitat that's elevated like that. It's really a unique opportunity. And are there scuba divers in the audience? I mean, I'm sure if you all have the opportunity to do it sometime, you'll find it to be extremely unique. I heard that many feel that the platforms must be removed in their entirety, and I think that's fair. If that was the deal that was made, commercial fishers don't want them to be limited in where they're able to fish. They'd like to be able to take advantage of the fish that are under there. And many environmental groups, that's just the obligation of the energy companies when they lived up in order to live up to their original agreement when they were installed. I also heard the suggestion that if we allowed reefing to occur, it'll be an incentive for oil companies to go out and seek new leases along the California coastline to do more offshore development. And I don't want to wax political. I mean, we have an administration right now that seems to be, damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, but I also know that we have NEPA, CEQA, Coastal Zone Management Act, and we have a wide range of laws that slow that sort of process down to a point where I really don't think that's much of a threat if the people of California don't want it. I heard from California regulators that the process to remove these rigs is complex, expensive, and time-consuming. However, the abandonment in the Gulf of Mexico seems to be a well-worked-out process, and the savings that might be realized in California are actually much greater financially than what's being realized on the Gulf of Mexico, and that may be the nature of the rigs down there and the amount of effort that goes into removing them. We have an extremely complex regulatory environment here. We have multiple agencies that all have responsibilities, some, I won't say overlapping, but entwined responsibilities, and the regulatory process and the review process required to undergo something like removing these platforms is extremely time-consuming and very expensive. I heard from California regulators that we have a reef program, an artificial reef program, but it's not funded and it hasn't matured to the point where it actually functioned to allow us to utilize it to reef platforms within state waters. I thought it was really interesting I think it was Joe's presentation where he talked about the North Sea governments are actually partners in the decommissioning. I don't know how they afforded to do this. Maybe they set money aside from the royalties of the oil that comes in. I don't know the mechanism, but that incentivizes getting them decommissioned. The government's actually, let's find the best way to get this done, get them out of here, because the cheaper it is, the more money we save as a government. As to alternate uses, I heard in Europe that they're working to look at co-locating hydrogen production, wind farms, that sort of thing. I personally, my interest is in food production and my research, so I think there's an opportunity for utilization of these platforms for food production, and even for the recovery of endangered species like the endangered white abalone or black abalone. We have recovery plans for the white abalone, but we don't have the infrastructure in place to really execute that plan. I think these platforms represent a unique asset to our state as the steward of our living marine resources, but I also believe that the only way to really explore the potential of this, the alternate decommissioning options and options like reefing, is to use the NEPA-CEQA process to actually initiate and then put the best science out there and let people take a look at it and make the decision. Until we start that process, we don't, we're sort of in a nebulous world of, meetings like this, trying to educate people and have a debate, but somebody needs to actually go out and actually put paper down that says this is what we want to do and how it should be done. I think that the complexity of our regulatory system is charged with protecting living resources, but unfortunately in this case, I think it actually is an impediment to realizing that mission. Whether it requires executive action or legislative action to overcome this, I don't know. I do believe that it would be worth the effort to provide the capacity for thousands of tons of marine life that are already existing under these platforms to have the opportunity to continue to exist. I know a lot of brittle stars don't have much economic value, neither do chordactis, those beautiful little orange anemones that live down there, but it is life, and we should work to preserve life in the marine world. I believe that species don't go away, they don't diminish because we've overhunted them. With certain species like certain fish species, we can overfish them. But the major cause for the loss of species in our world is the loss of habitat. As I fly into San Diego, on a terrestrial example, as I fly into San Diego back 30 years ago, the lights at nighttime are starting a lot further east than they used to. We're taking up more and more terrestrial space. I think the only reason we have gnatcatchers in the coastal zone in San Diego County is because we have Camp Pendleton and Miramar, which represent repositories of habitat that for these animals that can't be lost because of the military operations that are going on there. So we need to have these repositories of life and of habitat for future generations of not only the animals, but for the pleasure of our children and our grandchildren. With that, I'd like to thank Jerry and the organizing committee for inviting me to come. And that's another tick off of it. Jerry, I'll be back in 3 months on the next time you come up with something like this. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And our final person who's going to reflect on the last couple days is Robert Grove. Thank you.
Thanks. So, yeah, thanks, Jerry, for inviting me. And it wasn't until I looked at my name badge, it says, Robert Grove, Southern California Edison, retired. That sounded real final to me, but in struggling to kind of boost my ego, I have had a career since Edison. I know Jerry's had at least 3 careers, so I'm at Arts Center College of Design, and in their small academic group, but I get to teach artists and graphic designers and car designers basic ocean science. And so it's my 3 students that have the more colorful scientific posters out in front. And then it's my student that had, another student, Brittany, has a big mural out there taped on the wall. And then while I was guiding them to do murals last year at the Urban Ocean Weekend that the aquarium had. I painted that rig. So that's my painting, and my career isn't final. So sorry that took so long, but I thought I could lend a historical perspective to at least the artificial reef side of what you're hearing in these last days. So when you pull the rig completely out of the water, as we heard last night from Dr. Earl, you're disrupting habitat. And in fact, just before she went up to speak, I had a chance to really try to impress her with my, don't do that, I found out. But no, I said, I've heard you mention vertical relief and how these structures, especially some are in 1,000, 1,200 feet of water, just represents so many different structural entities in different fish communities. And I tried to say back to her, I know I heard Ann Bull speak the same thing. In fact, Ann had so much data now that she could present graphs with bar charts, and she had 200-foot structures and compilated all the fish groups there, and then the 1,200-foot. And I said, there's so much more habitat and so much more diversity of fish, and the bigger fish in these deeper water structures. And Dr. Earl looked at me and said, duh. so that's kind of one of the highlights of my career now. Yeah, I can retire now. Yeah, but thanks for setting me up, Ann. But Edison got involved with artificial reefs because of our coastal commission permit at San Onofre. Actually, the construction permit, which was first denied, and then one of the few permits. I think if you ask the coastal commission, how many permittees get to go back to the coastal commission with a second chance? And I think the answer is 0. But due to environmental issues and energy issues in the 1970s, we were allowed to go back. So when we did get a permit finally, there's a lot of conditions and constraints. And one is an independent study offshore once the power plant started operation. And if those independent studies deemed that the power plant was having an impact on the marine environment, Edison got to have the experience of shutting down the nuclear plant. But there was an area which was put into the permit a few years later, said, well, there could be a mitigation compensation option. So that wasn't even in the original permit. So Edison sent me out, and I tried to become a reef expert with my background as oceanography and engineering. And I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. It was probably 1981, and I went over to the Library of Congress. They're open at night. I don't know if they still are on the mall. And I went through their card files. Yeah, so some of you newer scientists, and they let you just run through the place. And I looked up artificial reefs, and this is the Library of Congress. They had one contribution, artificial reefs. It was a paper by Dick Stone, National Marine Fisheries, Bethesda, Maryland, and it talked about how he would go out and put concrete blocks in Florida waters and study them and compare concrete blocks to the local hard substrate habitat until, of course, the next hurricane, and then he couldn't find his blocks. But that was the only paper. And I know, yeah, we'd already known California was way ahead with artificial reefs, because they've been doing them since 1969. So the California Department of Fish and Game at the time, yeah, they were putting electric streetcars and auto bodies, and then they really diversified and started dumping tires into the ocean. So, yeah, in early conferences, some groups would even stand up and say, yeah, and we dump toilets in the ocean. So artificial reefs really started off with a bad reputation. But I do remember Ken Welton at Fish and Game later when he was kind of ribbed, well, can't we dump tires in the ocean anymore? And he actually went up to a guy at a conference and squeezed his bicep, and he said, if we catch you ever dumping a tire in the ocean, I want to make sure you're healthy enough, because we're going to call you and you'll be going out and getting those tires. So, yeah, everything was evolving. So there were international reef conferences every 4 years, and I was involved in those. And, yeah, they did good work. So anyway, what did I hear? Yeah, Jerry summed up nice. Don, yeah, I can go sit down now. But, yeah, this was a informational forum. I thought that was a cool word, because I always wonder, am I going to a scientific conference? Or, yeah, there's a lot of different words. But so I like the ideas. Yeah, experts could be asked questions, and experts could work with each other in this informational discussion. So right away, Mark Gold talked about the blue economy and safeguarding the coast. He talked about MPAs. They've been around for almost 10 years. And yeah, it's 16% of the coast is a marine protected area. So that's really admirable. I was in on the hearings of that, and yeah, it's another story, but it's really a happy ending, I think. And it's hopefully just midway or the start. So yeah, I liked what Don said about MPAs. Yeah, Northern California is disturbing that 97% of kelp is gone. So that's a bad deal. Betty Yee, yeah, she's the first up at thanking the Tonga people. I thought that was cool. State lands has not taken a stand, so yeah, I hope we get back to her. Sylvia Earle, yeah, I thought some of the things she said, yeah, maybe I took different notes than you all with Sylvia Earle. She said we should listen to the fish. I thought that was nice. Fish get unhappy when you remove their habitat. She said that. We need to rethink our regulations. We have to make sure the regulations catch up with science. I thought that was interesting. She mentioned respect and restore. Rigs are a big investment. Yeah, do we just want to remove them? Maybe we should remove some, yeah, but some may provide opportunities. Yeah, we get our existence from the ocean. Cool. The Galapagos, she brought up, yeah, only 3% is people, 97% is nature. Maybe we should rely on nature more. Rincon, Steve Curran. Yeah, there's a lot of money being spent removing this stuff, and some of it looks really junky. Yeah, so good. By the time John Smith talked, I was getting confused. That's not, no offense, John, but everybody stands up and explains how many rigs are offshore in California. And yeah, Dave Bader leaned over and said, "Do you know there aren't any rigs in the Santa Monica Bay?" I said, "Yeah." So that was our enlightenment. But there's some south of Santa Monica and a lot north, and some say 27, some say 23, some talk about the 4 islands. So, yeah, Betty, you said there are nine offshores. I don't know. But there's a lot out there, and they're in various forms of decommissioning, and I think the total is 27. Ann Bulk, yeah, amazing talk, Ann. Yeah, in these early discussions and conferences about artificial reefs, yeah, that was the inevitable question. Before you heard Don say it this morning, did anybody in the meeting, did anybody say we're still studying productivity in the context of the reefs really just attract fish, or do they produce fish? Was that said in this conference before you said it? No, good. Because, yeah, that was inevitable, always what was asked in all of the initial talks, you know, and when people like Dick Stone were out trying to just understand what lives on these various kinds of reef materials. So they would count. Now, when we talked to the Japanese, they were building reefs that were they're investing billions of dollars in reefs. So we looked to Japan in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, in fact, I remember at one conference in Japan, we said, yeah, you really spend that much money? I said, yeah, we're trying to get local fisheries enhanced so our fisher persons don't have to travel the world ocean and they're away from home, or they don't have to just bag fishing completely and go move to Tokyo, because we have 20 million people in Tokyo already, and we don't want to have them abandon their cultural homes, these little fishing villages. So yeah, we're trying to restore local fish. I said, that's admirable. He said, how much do you spend on reefs? You know, $10,000 or... And they said, well, I guess the difference is we don't build B-1 bombers for $1 billion a piece. So, okay, so another. Yeah, Jeremy had good data. That was cool. Yeah, so between Jeremy and Ann, the summaries, yeah, you don't hear about attraction anymore. You hear about very specific populations, and there's good science out there these days. Yeah, Tom Raftican, I thought Don summed up what he said nicely. Linda Kropp, Environmental Defense Center. Yeah, four lawyers and 2 biologists. Okay. Kim, yeah, but yeah, you got to follow the law. Yeah. Commercial fishing, yeah, I got in my notes we eat 2,000 pounds of French fries. I think I'll go on. Okay, how many, do you want me off the stage? Okay. Oh, we got to get to Angela. Angela, this is the first time in my 40-year scientific career I ever wrote in my notes the word violence. But yeah, I respect what you were saying, and I hope I learned. So thank you. Yeah, that's about it. So yeah, everybody else did a nice job summarizing. I hope I helped.
Can we get our speakers up on stage, please? And we can have, let's bring the house lights up. And there's an opportunity for all of you in the audience both to ask questions of our panelists, and also it's an invitation to all of you to offer some of your thoughts. You know, California is a remarkable state, and we're a leader in many ways in fighting climate change with a very ambitious goal of 100% clean energy by 2045. I think it's worth thinking a little bit about how might oil platforms help us achieve that goal. Because on the one hand, we're doing we're leaders certainly in renewable energy. We're decommissioning our 2 nuclear plants, which when they were both operating contributed about 21% of the total electrical energy to the state. That's clean energy. They're both going to be gone. Is there any role that platforms might play in helping us achieve that goal? And I will remind you 2 things. Leo Tolstoy once said, "Science doesn't tell us how to live. It has nothing to contribute on moral grounds. It is society that should determine the kind of world we will live in." And I think that's true. And California really is dedicated to that, I think. But I would also remind you of something the late Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said. You don't contribute to solving a technical issue or problem by asking a lot of uninformed people. Now, those aren't necessarily in conflict. Society should determine the kind of society we want to live in, but we ought to listen to the people who have expertise in science and technology in how to achieve that kind of world we want to live in. And that applies, I think, everywhere. But who wants to ask a question of our panelists or to contribute something? Dan, you had some good ideas, I thought. Let's get a microphone. Who's got a microphone? We're going to start up here first. Right there. And I want our panelists to react, to respond to comments.
Thanks. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Jeremy, and everyone. I'm an independent consultant. I work in the clean energy and climate change financing business in Asia. So I don't really have any vested interest in what's going on here in California, except I want to go diving on these rigs, and I haven't done that yet. So a few quick points here, and please bear with me. California is very much of a leader as the world's 5th largest economy in environmental issues. But in this specific context of rigs to reefs, or rig decommissioning, with 27 rigs, California's lost in the round-off. We've got more than 500 that have been converted to reefs in the Gulf of Mexico, and over a 30-year period. Now, if we can't figure out the science, then let's just forget about talking about science and never mention it again. So the leadership in rigs to reef is in the states of Texas and Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico. The only other places that I know of where there's any rig to reef conversion, or let me back off of the term reef for a second. The only other countries where I know of this going on is one in Malaysia, I think 7 structures in the Philippines, 20 undone or pending to be implemented in Australia, and I heard that maybe that some are going or approved now to be done in the Gulf of Thailand, in the waters of Thailand. So those are the other countries that are leading. The North Sea is not a leader, and what California has done, the way I understand the discussion of the legal framework here, basically it's replicating the policy framework that's in place for the North Sea, which is not based on science. So, but with that, prefacing some other remarks here, I didn't hear anyone really talk about how the existing rigs could be used to help California meet this long-term 100% renewable target. And the opportunity is not for California to be a leader in rig to reef business. The population of the reefs is not big enough. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity for using these, as Dr. Earl hinted at last night, as laboratories for marine protected areas management and other activities. So what Don Kent mentioned, that basically, and echoed what Dr. Earl said, the rigs are not fish aggregation devices. They are fish multiplier devices. The rigs are de facto marine protected areas. So if you take that out of the water, you're not demonstrating environmental leadership if you take live reefs and kill them, because the law that isn't really based on the latest science tells you that's what you have to do. The law should be changed. What are these rigs? The concept of rig conversion to reef, that language I think is actually extremely misleading, because these aren't rigs. The rigs aren't going to be converted to reefs. These are reefs now. So when we convert the asset from a petroleum production asset, we started out with the beginning of a rig's life. It's a petroleum production facility. After 10 or 15 years of production, it's probably been fully amortized and depreciated. Okay, at that point, we also have a lot of marine life that's formed on the rigs. So what we have now is not a petroleum rig, we have a reef that is hosting a petroleum production facility. When the wells are shut in, we don't have a petroleum production facility anymore. We have a reef that's a de facto marine protected area. So what would be the best use, aside from full removal, what would be the best economic and environmental pathway for the use of these assets? And Joe, in his presentation on the net environmental benefit analysis, hinted at this, but I didn't hear anyone talk about the greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas balance. The coral reefs are mostly calcium carbonate, and each ton of calcium carbonate has 0.44 tons of CO2 locked up. That's how we're going to commercialize carbon capture, utilization, and storage, not by stripping CO2 off of fossil fuel combustion units and put them into the ground for enhanced oil recovery. Someone asked about the cathodic protection systems, or someone mentioned this last night, but no one mentioned that when the voltage and the current is properly tuned, properly set on cathodic protection systems on rigs, they cause the precipitation of calcium carbonate in the form of aragonite. So if California wants to be a leader in this space, there's a tremendous opportunity to use these assets as monitoring stations, as marine protected areas, as logistical support bases for future offshore energy development, renewable energy development, offshore wind, offshore solar, ocean biomass, maybe ocean thermal energy conversion may not work in the waters here, and regenerative marine aquaculture. And these could be done and ultimately support a thriving economic activity that addresses food security, ocean acidification, especially, which is the biggest climate change problem, and meeting California's 100% renewable energy target. And in this context, this idea of using the rigs as marine aquaculture, for marine aquaculture, renewable energy, and ecotourism for ecosystem services, now that's a business model where California can be a leader, and you don't need very many rigs left in the water to do that.
Would anybody want to respond to that? Any of you up front? Anybody?
I'm happy to respond to that. There we go. I think as we, from the State Lands Commission's perspective, as we move forward with the analysis of the decommissioning for Platform Holly, those kinds of ideas and thoughts and the methodology about how we might go about analyzing different alternatives, right? From the basic of full versus partial removal, and then if it's partial removal or leaving the entire platform in place, what are repurposing ideas, so that we can fully bring that into the comprehensive scope of the EIR document, and most importantly, the bigger umbrella of what our commission would be analyzing, informed by the EIR and other input and information and data, is what's in the best interest of the state. So it's exactly those kinds of ideas that we'll be seeking and soliciting from all of you and others as we develop that framework for analyzing the future of Platform Alley.
So I want to reinforce that because I think that's a very important statement. So the kinds of activities that you have proposed, that would be involved in different levels of removal of these platforms and in any repurposing, those are going to be considered in the EIR process.
That's our goal, yes.
That's encouraging. That's very encouraging. Anybody else want to respond to that? Okay, we've got one first in the back. Linda, we had one in the back first.
Hi, my name's Thomas Liu. I'm with BOEM. I'm the Deputy Regional Director for the Pacific region, which is the West Coast and Hawaii. I just wanted, this is less of a question, but more of a follow-up to Jennifer's comment about clarifying jurisdictions. And so I just thought it might be useful for the crowd to understand sort of the breakdown of roles on the federal side. Basically, BOEM is conducting the NEPA based upon best available science, most of which is BOEM funded. And Bessie, on the other hand, is responsible for reviewing the decommissioning application, managing the overall process, and they actually have all of the official approvals and permits to issue on the federal side. At least from the Department of Interior, there are other permits and approvals that other federal agencies do have. But I did want to just sort of describe the breakdown between BOEM and Bessie. Overall, it is a very complex process, as everybody in this room knows, and so we all work together pretty well on the interagency decommissioning working group, not only with, on the federal partner side, but with our state and local partners. So did want to just clarify that for everybody.
Okay.
If anybody has anything else to add, I'm happy to, defer.
I'm not sure everybody in this auditorium and those watching remotely, they know what BOEM is. Bessie is just tell us what Bessie is.
Bessie is, not to go into all of the history, but in the Gulf of Mexico.
We don't need the whole history.
Yeah, so we were the Minerals Management Service up until 2011 when BOEM and Bessie were split into two essentially sister agencies. We are actually still co-located in the same office. This is sort of a simplistic breakdown, but BOEM is sort of in charge of all the way up to leasing, and then Bessie is sort of in charge of a lot of the post-leasing. And then there's some exceptions, including BOEM is supporting Bessie on the NEPA here, but that's sort of an easy in general breakdown between BOEM's responsibilities and Bessie's. And clearly this is post-leasing, so. Sort of Bessie has all the sort of decisions and permits to issue there. It's a simplistic breakdown, but a easier rule of thumb to think about.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi there. So I feel like I've come into this with one of the more naive minds for this whole conversation, and I think it's really easy for me to think, yeah, this is an easy decision. Keep the structures. There's life, but now learning all the different perspectives from many, many professionals. I'm just wondering, how realistic is it that a law could be changed before even more decommissioning projects or proposals come? Is it possible that a law will change to allow for even the potential of the reef to rig to reef? Because maybe I thought that was already a possibility, but now I'm learning that California, that's not set in stone. How is that possible? Sorry, I don't know if that was a good question.
Who wants to take that?
Okay, I'll try. So it's always possible, right? State legislators are constantly seeking ideas from our constituents and stakeholders for ways to make new laws or make better existing laws to help improve our communities and our government. So it's always possible. And in fact, I think Chris and maybe some of the speakers on yesterday's afternoon panel talked about some of the various efforts over the last couple years. I think maybe 2 or 3 efforts to try and update the existing rigs to reef law. So that's always possible. I think what we heard yesterday was that there's some significant obstacles and challenges based on existing law. The rigs to reef law is really an incentive program for operators, right, to save some money in order and create reefs. So when you have all the different parties seeing some significant obstacles in that law, which doesn't allow them to take full advantage of it, then there's some tweaks that need to happen to make that fully implementable. We also heard, I think from Fish and Wildlife, that there's some significant funding and resource and staffing issues associated with full implementation of that program too. So these are not small hurdles. These are significant obstacles and challenges. And so in order to be successful at updating the law so that it can be implementable, there's going to have to be a lot of work from various stakeholders to come to some agreement with the legislature on how to move forward in the best way possible. But it's always possible.
I'd add a little bit to that. I think Eric Wilkins with the Department of Fish and Wildlife in his presentation yesterday outlined some of the challenges that Jennifer was describing for the California's Artificial Reef Program. And that's important because the federal laws for reefing on the Outer Continental Shelf, which is where the 23 platforms are, require the state to have an artificial reef program and to accept the reef through that program in order for it to be reefed. Without a program, the federal law doesn't allow for reefing. And that program is really still has a long way to go to be up and running in order to where it needs to be in order to accept a reef. And so that's one of those big challenges that we face in doing that. Regarding timing, which was part of your question, that's still an open question. There's although decommissioning is occurring today, wells are being plugged and abandoned actively on a number of platforms. That work is going to take a number of years to complete. The platforms are actually very small and constrained, and so in order to bring the equipment out there to do that work, it's a very delicate and well choreographed dance of moving large equipment around. And so it's not something that you can just start plugging all the wells simultaneously. It has to be done piecemeal and takes quite a while. And so it remains to be seen if the legislation can be changed in time, if the artificial reef program of the state of California can be developed and brought up to speed to where it needs to be by the time the platforms are actually ready for removal or protection in place.
And it occurs to me that in the EIR process and leading up to it, one of the voices that we need to get more actively involved is the scientific community on what all of the benefits that we've heard. And sometimes it's hard to get the scientific community involved. Mark Gold said that the other night. Anybody want to comment on that? Come on, Don, you said science. Don't be bashful.
Well, like I said in my opening remarks, scientists have a job to identify a problem and then design a set of observations to answer the questions generated by that problem and then to report the results. And when we start going out and acting as advocates, it puts the results of our work into question. And that's why we want to be little nerds back in our laboratories and publish our papers and leave it at that and let the best science be dealt with amongst peer review outside. If questions are asked, we try to answer them. I know there's a change in attitude about that. Dr. Lipchenko, that used to head the NOAA, had worked for some time to develop a group called Compass in Washington, D.C., that's all about scientists getting out there and having their voices heard. I question that. We should always advocate for good science. You'll never find a cancer researcher that doesn't say, I want to find a cure for cancer. But at the same time, you don't want that person necessarily completely funded by a drug company that's coming up with just one alternative that puts the direction and limits it. We're reticent, we're just reticent to get up and have personal opinions because we want the science itself to stand on its own. If you want us to come out and report on the science, Ann did it, Jeremy did it. There's a great group of people that stood up yesterday and just said, here's what we observed. And I did what I could to select the things out that really caught my attention. The abundance, the diversity, answering the question about attraction versus production. Those are the things that stood out to me as a scientist. But at the end of it all, it's still going to come down to what the public perceives and wants. And that's just how it is. And we don't live in a benevolent dictatorship. Everybody gets to have their word listened to, and science is just a component of that. It's not the bottom line. No,
it certainly is only one component. But I think if the boundary between public education and advocacy is a very fuzzy line, and I think in some cases we haven't done a very good job of informing the public about what the science tells us on some of these complicated issues. Everybody disagree? All right, let's go back out here. We have one back there.
So, the companies realize that it takes a long time to plan for decommissioning, and then I think it was highlighted that there's a long contracting process as well to schedule all this heavy lift equipment. But I see a lot of passivity on, well, we're just going to go through the process and see how the process comes. There doesn't seem to be a lot of proactivity in trying to fix the California Artificial Reef program or plan, trying to do things that will allow the state and the public to choose among all of the options and not be constrained and have maybe the best option not on the table. So I just encourage the folks that work in the state to be a bit more proactive and not wait for, we'll just see how things come out through the public approval process or the public permitting process, and really start thinking about your role is to allow all the good options to be on the table and not have obstacles that the public probably doesn't even realize. Why would the public realize that we can't reef when we've had a California artificial reef plan for 40 years? And I think you need to be more proactive.
Anybody from the state want to respond to that?
I don't disagree with our responsibility as state government, as individual state agencies, and as representative of these agencies to be very clear and accurate and articulate in the way that these laws and the legal frameworks are set up so that the public and stakeholders and those folks are invested in what the future looks like can be very clear about how they advocate for what their values and needs are. I think I just wanted to take this opportunity as we're talking about the Rigs to Reef program and laws, that's really focused on federal waters. So when we talk about platform holly in state waters, that does not need a functioning Rigs to Reef program for our agency in coordination with Fish and Wildlife and Coastal Commission to evaluate all the options in place. Like I said, the Rigs to Reef program is an incentive program for operators, and there's a lot of different complexities and elements to that we've talked about over the last day or so. But in state waters, the state has the ability to look at all the different options on the table that we've talked about over the last couple of years or a couple days and then some. And so that's exactly what we'll be doing. And we don't need the Rigs to Reef law to be able to implement those if that's the decision that the commission, along with our regulatory partners, decide.
So there are no constraints then on evaluating all the options in terms of what will happen to these platforms in state waters?
Not as it relates to the Rigs to Reef program for federal waters. Yes, all options are on the table as far as we're concerned, and those decisions will be founded on the best available science and, of course, very broad and comprehensive public engagement.
Right. Go ahead, over here.
Hi, my name is Mary Nishimoto, and I am a researcher at UCSB. I work with Ann Bull, and I've been working with Milton Love for well over 20 years. And in addition to that, I am the liaison officer for the fisheries and oil industries in the Santa Maria Basin and Santa Barbara Channel area. And so I would think that I am one of the people that is fairly informed about both the ecology of the platforms and also what is going on in this process of as we move forward to make decisions about decommissioning of these platforms, because I have been able to be a participant in the California State Lands Commission's process, which I do want to applaud. They've done a wonderful job. Thank you, Jennifer and Seth and Marina and others who very actively, proactively are engaging the public and stakeholders and other agencies, and through monthly updates about what's going on at Platform Holly and the piers and Rincon Island. Also, they've had fairly regular information forums as town halls in Goleta for the public, and people from Santa Barbara, throughout Santa Barbara, and also the tribes do come and participate to be informed. So I appreciate all the opportunities that State Lands has provided to the public and to our wider community to become involved. And also I thank Jerry and all the participants who have attended this forum. And one thing I want to suggest to everyone here, particularly State Lands, maybe the Aquarium can be involved, other agencies can collaborate, is to have forums for the public, which is what Bob mentioned, and Dawn, basically everyone, public forums that are provided in the evening, locally in Santa Barbara, so that the public whom we do want to inform, so that they can be effective stakeholders who effectively participate in this decision making, so that they are well informed. And like as you were saying, they know what the challenges are. They know what they might do as citizens to talk to legislators and say, hey, I know what the situation is about the ecology of these platforms. I have this is what I am advocating. It's not my job as a scientist or any of our jobs to say you should have this opinion or that opinion about the platforms being left in or out, but we, as a citizen, I've been informed by all of these experts, and I see what the challenges are. You go to the legislators, I want to see this, and I have this opinion about what should be done. And then in this way, it will be, we hope, the best decisions are being made by those who do want to represent the public.
I think having meetings in the evening so
Yes.
that the public can attend is a very good idea, because unless you're retired from Southern California Edison, most of us have to work. All right, who we have, yes.
Hello?
We've got one in the back here.
Related to the proactivity on the part of the agencies, I was wondering if State Lands and perhaps BOEM together has given any thought about starting a programmatic EIR, EIS process for decommissioning in general. I know the Gulf of Mexico has been very effective in doing that, looking at these larger regional issues, and then specific projects can be undergo CEQA and NEPA underneath that programmatic, but the otherwise the real, or I guess the other option is to wait until that first application comes in, and then all of this discussion and debate is surrounded that specific project when we know there are multiple projects coming forward, there are regional issues, and I think there's enough known about the fundamentals of how you go about removing or partially removing or leaving in place, and all those things could be evaluated, and that public dialogue and process could be started without a specific project in mind, but looking at the regional issues.
So Jennifer, any regional thoughts about a general EIR process? Or Cassidy?
I'm sure Jennifer can jump in here, and Thomas as well. Fortunately, we have a lot of expertise in this room. But it's my understanding that it's kind of both happening. I think there will be an individual CEQA document prepared for Platform Holly. At the same time, on somewhat of a parallel track, there will be a programmatic EIR developed by BOEM for the OCS platforms, the ones in federal waters.
Go ahead, Chris. Here, let me give you this.
So one of the fundamental aspects of the existing state rigs to reefs law is this concept of a net environmental benefit, and that's very much on a case-by-case basis. So each platform, I mean, a programmatic EIR would certainly, EIR would certainly set the landscape, but there would have to be individual impact analysis, especially when you can factor in the net environmental benefit analysis.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, this is Seth Blackman with the State Lands Commission. I was just going to mention that even with a current decommissioning process for the federal OCS, which BOEM will be working on in their NEPA document, because of the correlation from the Pacific Outer Continental Shelf to shore, all of the pipelines and everything else that travel and traverse across state property, this will most likely be a combined EIR-EIS. So the state will be involved in that process as well. And I just think, to echo sort of some of what we've already heard, the state of California, particularly through the State Lands Commission, doesn't have an advocacy position on these things. That's not our role. Our role is to follow the laws it's currently written and has been passed. And so that's where we look at this. I think the information program that we have to get out to the public is through CEQA. That's our primary methodology. But we're also trying to do this in a more proactive format by doing town halls and getting out and listening to all of the various stakeholder communities, which really does inform our process, and most likely should inform and will inform our decision makers. So I just was going to say, I think that there is already sort of the beginnings of the programmatic aspect to this. Whether or not the law changes to facilitate an additional discussion as it relates to the Pacific OCS, that's a different question. And everybody here has an individual vote, and you have your own individual advocacy that's for you to take. Every scientist does as well. It's not for them to necessarily advocate their own personal science, but we all vote as individual citizens. That's your ability to sort of make change. You can talk with your family members, you can do all those types of things, you can talk to friends, you can help to inform them. So there's a little bit of an individual responsibility on everybody in this room who's an expert to help get that information out. That's something that I do think is kind of lacking, and that's something that we at State Lands Commission identified as needing to be able to get out there and have these conversations, both to hear the concerns that people in the public have about this, and then dispel myths and answer real questions that maybe we hadn't previously considered. So I just think that, you know, the difference between asking government to advocate internally for certain types of programs versus listening to changes in stakeholder values and community interests is very different. So, you know, it's not really our role, just like it's not the scientist's role to go out and advocate for their particular science. It's to provide the forum for the public, to provide the best science available, and do that information process. So that's one thing that the state is trying to get better at, but for all of us and for everyone we know, it's really about being proactive in our votes, about being proactive in informing ourselves and informing our kind of general polity around us. So that was just kind of my comment on top of that.
And I think that's a very important comment. And so there's a responsibility each of us has to get out and talk about these issues. But you also said, and follow the law as currently stated. Does the law as currently stated constrain the discussion of all the options that we heard about yesterday and the relative benefits of full removal, no, partial removal, no removal?
This is why this is sort of exciting for the State Lands Commission, because Platform Holly is not restrained, which gives us an opportunity to have the discussion in full in a way that the current Rigs to Reefs program just doesn't contemplate because of the permanent liabilities. As Jennifer noted, this was a voluntary opt-in by operators as an incentive to retain the structures that have, you know, this marine life on it. But the program as written as it relates to California's side, not the federal side, but to California's side does not allow that. And to Cassidy's comment earlier and Eric's comment earlier, in California, in order for the program to be funded and take off, have the requisite amount of money, personnel, and everything else, it requires actually having the first party come in and be approved for the Rigs to Reefs program. So there's this sort of cart before the horse issue where we don't have a program unless we actually have somebody opt in on the law or on the Rigs to Reefs program, but we've written the law in a way that no one wants to opt in. So we've constrained that aspect.
Right.
And so that's the really important sort of fix. And I think the question that was asked a little earlier from the audience is, can we fix this? Absolutely. It is a legislative fix, as Jennifer said, but that's not for us to individually advocate.
No, I understand that. But everybody in this room who's not part of a state agency or federal agency has a role to play in this, and that's what I keep trying to hammer away at. And I think the other important point that you've made is that since Platform Holly is not constrained, there's an opportunity for people who believe in the importance of science and looking at all the options that they should be active in this case. Agree? All right, Bob. I thought you were retired.
Yeah. Do you want me to review that again? Yeah, the artificial reef for kelp at San Clemente had a program EIR, and State Lands is the lead agency, I presume still. And at least when I was there, we did the experimental reef, and then the first reef of 100 and turned out to be 70 acres. That could be used as a template for everything that's going on with the rigs, because the public participation aspects, the impact aspects of even concerning diesel fuel emissions from the various equipment, that's all been worked through. And yes, it's just a good template, I think, that at least could be looked at. We spent over $1 million on this program EIR, so hopefully that's useful.
We have two in the third or fourth row, and then we'll come up and we get you.
Yeah, I just had a couple other takeaways from yesterday, and that was, I think it was Wynn Thornton's presentation, noting the expense of the heavy lift hardware to come in for a removal operation, and that there are such magnitude in the expense that the project was driven by the availability of this equipment. So so as from a timing perspective, if the equipment becomes available for one platform and it's such a high cost item, it will have a tendency to accelerate or a incentive for other platforms to grow, to be attended to in that duration, whether it be 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. There are several platforms that was noted that are undergoing P&A operations right now, and then afterwards, I'm not sure what will happen to those structures, if they will wait for the law to catch up with them, or they will just go ahead and commit to their obligation and take those platforms out. It's the timing issue is what I'm trying to bring up here, is that once the infrastructure gets established for one platform, there will be a tendency to accelerate and get other platforms, and there will be a sense of losing an opportunity to, because the economics will drive the project and not really necessarily the law or the preferential science. So it was it's not happening in 10 years or 5 years. It could be happening in five or less years. or 6 years or 7 years, depending upon the permitting path and the coordination of Bessie and the local agencies. So it's not something that can be talked about forever. It's something that's happening in the near term. And my concern is that you may lose an opportunity to retain some of these biomass. And some of the structures that are being currently P&A were noted as being some of the highest bioproducers. So it's not something that just we can still talk about for several years.
And that was a point that Sylvia made. Once one of these platforms is pulled out, you have lost that reef. And so there is some urgency in this, because as you say, this is going to be 5, 6, 7 years, right? Right. Right. So once they're here, might as well do more. Right. Right. Okay. Yep.
Hi, my name is Si Young Park. I'm a Aquarium education volunteer. I am retired, in quote, from a geography professor in Illinois. When I moved here, I just started this volunteer and I really enjoy it, and thank you very much for running such a fantastic aquarium. And also this conference has been very informative. As a public, I really enjoyed it, and it doesn't take rocket scientists to realize that rigs are not problem. We need to use the rigs for a reef. I think I was convinced by all these speakers about that. And also the artificial reef hasn't been funded, so the problem is money. You know, where do we get money? And I think we need something like Superfund for doing this rigs to reef, because I don't want these fat cat oil companies think about this as a loophole to get away for not clearing their mess. So I think to do this rigs to reef program, we need some sort of a super fund for oil companies to be responsible to make our reuse of these rigs. I can give you an example of aquamarine. I mean not aquamarine, aquaculture in Korea. Fantastic. What is it? Fantastic abalone field utilizing kelp, and there are just miles and miles of that in the ocean. And California, I heard that the kelp forest has been gone. I think we have to rebuild the kelp forest and start more food from the ocean, like the one of the missions of the this aquarium. And to do that, we have to get the super fund.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to that? Don?
Yeah, it's my understanding that part of the process in decommissioning, I think somebody was talking about yesterday, was that if they have a reefing option, then 80% of the savings potentially could go into a fund for the state to utilize for conservation efforts. I don't know what the exact mechanism or where that would reside, but it would definitely help support conservation efforts within the state of California for marine projects that that wouldn't put a further burden on the general fund of the state.
So let's clarify. Are the oil companies responsible for the full cost of removal and restoration of the seafloor, regardless of what option is exercised?
In state waters.
In state waters.
If the State Lands Commission determines that full removal is the preferred way to go, yes, the oil companies are the lessee is responsible for that full removal and restoration.
the cost of. And if the decision is made that that's not the best option, aren't they still responsible for that amount of money, and it would go into some kind of a fund for research, conservation, et cetera?
That could be part, at least in state waters, that could be part of the decision that the commission makes in relieving a lessee from full removal responsibilities, but that's not dictated specifically in law.
Okay, all right.
Hi. One thing that I had in my slide, and Cassie I think also had on his, was we have the interagency decommissioning work group, and I thought I didn't go into much detail, but I thought it worth mentioning for everyone that it's a group. I think it was restarted about 3 years ago. It's the state and federal agencies. We meet quarterly, where the agencies are trying to work through a lot of these processes right now, and it's probably helpful for everybody to know that this discussion isn't just going to end after today. So I just thought I'd bring that up.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got one over here.
My name is Matt Razvani, and I am the chair of Technical Advisory Committee of Office of Spill Prevention and Response, Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I have a question, putting that hat on, which actually we have asked that question at the Technical Advisory Committee, is not reef related, but it is decommissioning related. Has there been geological studies to see, as you shut in these wells, what is going to happen to those natural seeps? Are there going to be more oil coming out of those? I know these are low pressure wells, the ones that you are shutting down, but the other ones, what kind of impact may have on those SIPs?
Who'd like to take that? Jennifer, you seem to be very popular up here. Okay, good, good. You've been too quiet.
So I think that's a really good question, and obviously for Hawley, the one in the state, that's one of the areas where there's the most active seeps that are occurring in the channel right now. So it's my understanding, and maybe either Seth or Jennifer can expand on this, that there is a seep study that's already being kind of evaluated and will be conducted soon. So it's an important thing, because seeps are really a natural thing in the channel area, and it'd be interesting to know, hey, as these facilities become removed, what is going to happen with the seeps, and measuring where that oil is coming from and fingerprinting it is an integral part of that. So that's all I really had to say with that.
So is the short answer we don't know?
We're looking at it, I think.
I think that's the appropriate question at this point. We are contracting with, I'm looking at Seth, UCSB right now to study the seep activity around Platform Holly in the channel to address that question exactly.
Good.
So stay tuned.
Good. We have who has the next one?
In the back. Thank you, everyone, for the last few days. I've heard a lot of important discussion about the decommissioning options and complications involved with different potential decommissioning. But what I didn't hear much or really any discussion of is the consequences of continued drilling. Yesterday it was mentioned that because decommissioning is so complicated and expensive, frequently companies choose to renew their lease and continue to drill despite continuing drops in demand, which that filled something in for me. I've been trying to figure out how, since cap and trade was put into place, California emissions from fossil fuels have only increased. And California prides itself on being the leader in climate solutions, but yet fossil fuels from California are among the 10 highest fossil fuel emitters in the world, second only to the Canadian tar sands. So it seems like until we can really account for the impacts of drilling and burning these fossil fuels and selling things like petroleum coke, that's one of our California's top exports overseas, which is a climate accelerator. We need to really address that and factor that into this process, because that's what caused the problem we're in the first place. And by properly financially accounting for those risks, we might be better able to encourage companies to go towards the decommissioning route instead of renewing their leases.
Who would like to
I'm
respond?
just wondering if anybody could address that.
Jennifer?
No, I was just thinking there might be somebody in the oil industry that would like to say something.
Yeah, do we have somebody from the oil industry who would like to?
I'm not from the oil industry anymore, but I'd be happy to address that.
All right, go ahead.
Again, my name is Matt Rezvani, and I did used to work for ARCO and BP in my previous life before I retired. So, actually, petroleum coke production has nothing to do with producing oil and getting the oil out of the ground. Petroleum coke production is a function of refining. So regardless of whether California produces oil or not, that petroleum coke will be produced based on the demand of basically gasoline and diesel fuel or whatever we use. So those are two entirely different functions, and we shouldn't mix them up. California is in the top, maybe top producer of CO2 because of the demand that exists for gasoline and diesel fuel. We have more cars per capita than probably anywhere else in the world. I'll tell you an example. I have 4 cars, and there are 2 people in my family.
Matt, you're the problem. All right, let's take another one. Yes, down here, is he in front? Dan? Are we, okay, we'll get to you then, Dan, next. Go ahead.
I'm Herb Leedy. I work for Bessie, but out of the Gulf of Mexico region. And I wanted to clarify a little bit about the Rigs to Reef program that I've heard some answers. First off, the artificial reef program was first developed back in the 80s. The National Artificial Reef Program was developed by the National Marine Fisheries. So it gave the states the ability to create their own artificial reef programs that would accept these reefs within federal waters. So that's how it works in the state of Louisiana, Texas, the Gulf states, also the Atlantic states, and even here in California. But so you can accept these reefs into your programs on federal waters. Now, as far as it being an incentive to the oil industry, really the way we work this is we facilitate the transfer of the material to the states so that they can put it into their artificial reef program. For instance, Florida spent I forget how many millions of dollars to prepare and clean the Oriskany off of Pensacola to be reefed in that area there. It provides a lot of money for the local economies, Pensacola in particular, for divers to go out and visit that reef, but it's in federal waters. So what the reefing program does, it just provides a means for the oil and gas companies to transfer their material into your program. And so the monetary benefit goes to both. So the state gets to collect part of that money. I think here in California you would collect up to 80% of their cost savings. But really, as far as a Rigs to Reef program, it's no different than an artificial reef program. So it's really just the material that's going into your California program. And I think you've got some, even the Yukon off of San Diego. I believe that's San Diego City, though. I'm not sure if that's under the state program. It is in state waters. I believe there are some reefs off of Long Beach here near Eureka. If I'm not mistaken, there's some concrete rubble. But all of that costs money because that had to be taken out to that reef site and deposited on the bottom. What's really happening with the rigs is that it's already there. So you're saving that money of transporting it out, of cleaning it, because the steel's already clean. It's just the material that you're placing into your program. And there's not really a question, I guess, but I was just trying to clarify.
But I think you have someone behind it would like to comment on that, and then we'll get back. No, we were going to comment on what was just.
Who's that? Raise your hand. Who is it that I'm supposed to give this to?
Well, Jerry, if I can, I think somebody said it earlier. We do have a process. We do have a law in California that allows it, but the process is so complicated. I mean, I looked at a flow chart of it one time, and I couldn't figure out where the start was. Like one of those things, a rat trying to get through the maze, but there's no cheese in there. It was, you know, and I think the last attempt at legislation in the state was really to modify and try to simplify that, not to cut any corners, but rather to just get a clearer path through the existing regulatory process.
Back, you were going to comment on the statement about the rig. No, in the back.
In the back. Where?
And right there. Hold your hand. Thank you. Then we're going to come back up here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Rabin. I was a LA Times reporter for many, many years until I became an endangered species. But I'm not retired yet. I have a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one is, isn't this much, much more complicated than the question of rigs to reefs? California's regulatory structure has so many different mandates built in specifically to the Coastal Act about protecting marine resources, but also looking at the land side impacts of any action in federal waters or state waters that could be inconsistent with California's Coastal Act, especially Chapter 3, the crux of it. So it is not, from my vantage point, and I spent 2 years on the staff of the Coastal Commission, isn't this much, much more than legislation about artificial reefs in California? This is an extremely complex structure that needs to be addressed in multiple ways. True or false?
Cassidy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got some of the experience to inform the answer to that one, but contributing to it is the fact that it's not just one agency with that discretionary authorization, right? You saw Simon Poulter's laundry list of agencies. There's a very lengthy dozens of state and federal and local agencies with a responsibility and their own individual mandates under their regulations that inform that decision. And so you're absolutely right. It is very complicated. It's not simply a rig or a reef. It's is the option or the alternative or the proposal consistent with all those laws and able to obtain all the authorizations it needs. And I think as we go through these first projects, Platform Holly is likely to be the first, and the development of the CEQA document for that's going to include that discussion of all the different regulations in there, and it's going to help also to some of the questions that were raised earlier about the science. It's going to have the additional benefit of pulling together a lot of the scientific understanding and packaging it into kind of one central repository for that project that will help inform future projects, help inform the public also about the state of the science and that regulatory complexity that you're speaking to.
And so again, then Cassidy, I would say that Holly really is an opportunity for the community, including the scientific community, to weigh in on this, right? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And through the public comment process,
Right.
and through the various stages to pull together that information.
Right. Bob?
I think it all has to do with your background. And so for permitting a nuclear power plant, we had 128 permits from different agencies, state, federal, and local. And when it comes to permitting an artificial reef, it's duck soup. So, and no, NIFS, when they wanted to permit this reef off of Palos Verdes for compensation to the DDT and the Melrose settlement, and yeah, Dan Pondella and National Marine Fisheries, yeah, they came to me and just said, "What do you need?" And it's a list. It's not a mystery. You can just go down the list, and yeah, it's doable.
I guess the other thing I'd add to that is, my remarks yesterday, a lot of what I said was informed by the 4-H removals. And so there is a recent history there for the regulatory process, what that looks like, the types of environmental issues that came up. As I noted yesterday, there have been some changes. Greenhouse gas emissions, for example, wasn't so much of an issue back then. It certainly is now. But that aside, it does set up somewhat of a framework, and it helps inform us about what these future efforts will look like, and the process involved there, and the types of issues that come up.
Yesterday, I was impressed to hear from the North Sea people, but also here, that safety is a big concern now. So when you go through this, yeah, when you have such heavy equipment, and yeah, you saw the little guys on these. Yeah, there's some new big issues. Yeah.
One here and then over there.
Hi, Linda Kropp from the Environmental Defense Center. Given the experience with the 4-H platforms and the fact that the permit review required full cleanup of all debris, and it's 23 years later and that hasn't happened, how do we prevent that? I mean, I hope we still address that, but in terms of future projects, how do we prevent that from happening? Thank you.
Who would like to take that?
I'll take a first stab at that, since
Okay.
The 4-H shell mounds are still in or a portion of them are still in our jurisdiction. I think learning from that and understanding, especially from the community in Santa Barbara and others, about the impacts of that decision, and the lack of clarity on the ultimate disposition of those shell mounds, and why decisions were made, and learning from that, and making sure that as we move forward with Piers 421 and Platform Holly, that we address those issues directly and honestly, and as clearly as possible, so that we aren't 23 years down the road and still trying to figure out what happened in the decision-making process back then. And so we're learning from those efforts. And as you know, Linda, we're in constant communication with you and your colleagues and the Santa Barbara community about the shell mounds and what to do with those. And of course, because that's on such a forefront of our minds and in our workload, that's going to necessarily inform how we approach and deal with the decisions made for Platform Holly. So our goal is proactive and articulate and accurate and very clear in the decision-making process.
We had somebody had a hand up. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, this is Kim Selko from Commercial Fishermen of Santa Barbara. I feel like my understanding of all of the pieces are coming together, and I'm really grateful for this symposium. And one of those is that Holly is this opportunity that's less constrained. We already have the framework of what an entity would need to meet and be guided by the CEQA framework for a possible proposal for reuse or some other option aside from full removal, and that full removal would be a cost borne by the taxpayers, and that could be a savings if someone comes up with an alternative that's less costly. So it seems like the state wants to see this range of alternatives, and that we've been encouraged to have meetings and have people speak and understand this. But at the end of the day, you need a corporation that's capable of proposing something financially feasible. And we've heard, well, scientists should get involved, but scientists aren't really the ones that can come up with these business ideas. So there's a bit of a disconnect for me in terms of how is this going to play out, that there's going to be alternatives put on the table. Are these going to be just ideas, or are they going to be having to be actual business proposals? And how is that going to happen if all these conversations are local? Because probably it's not going to be some citizen of Goleta that comes up with a plan to reuse Platform Holly, even if we all see there could be benefits locally to having that business.
Maybe I can try to tie the two together here. Linda's issue and then what you've just said. There are templates for how to do things, and there are corporations that can get involved. You know, I was part of one, and yeah, we don't need a template of how to break the law, but you can have a template looking at the Montrose settlement, and it was proposed that they go out and excavate the DDT. So to me, it's the same thing as a shell mound. After all these years, you said 23 years, there's sedimentation on top. And we heard yesterday that when Mussel Watch from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife put mussels on top of the mounds, that there's no harm, no foul, I guess. Didn't know that, but yeah, there could be settlement issues instead of just take it out issues, and more science may be needed. You know, the elephant in the room about removing the shell mounds now is the toxins in that, where are they going to go? They're not going to go on a boat. They're going to be dispersed in the water, in the sedimentation, and it's going to go someplace else. That's why Montrose, the settlement, they leave the DDT in place. It's now under more sedimentation. And yeah, there's issues there, but there was a settlement, agreed upon settlement. So in the future, with sea level rise, I would think there's going to be a lot of activity on the coast. Different development, redevelopment, moving things around. As part of that, maybe you could get corporations involved to try to settle some of these unsolved previous issues while you're going ahead. Yeah, that's how Edison got involved with wetland restoration, because the harbors or the port authorities had to do wetland restoration as direct mitigation to filling in the harbor in subtidal lands. Edison did not fill in subtidal lands. We impacted fish. So, but it was the same formula that, yeah, we did a restoration of a wetland, and we had performance standards, but we didn't have to have the performance standards of the harbors because we were different. So you can get different entities involved and still come up with settlements, and I don't, yeah, that still breaks the law, but maybe, yeah, there's other ways.
Anybody want to add anything further? Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, I thought the question about the identified disconnect between the CEQA process and identifying alternatives, and then where we go from there, particularly with repurposing, how does that all fit together? So I'll caveat this, and hopefully, you know, Seth can't kick me from way back there, but as he mentioned yesterday, this is the first time that the State Lands Commission has been in charge of a decommissioning project in this way and is fully responsible for the ultimate disposition of a platform. Previously, Chevron 4H mounds, the 4H platforms and other offshore infrastructure, it's the lessee that applies to us, and we respond to what their proposal is. So we're brainstorming as we speak how we're going to set up this framework to address exactly what you asked. So the way that we've approached this so far, and we are in a huge learning curve, and all ideas are welcome, is the CEQA process, and that mechanism is a great way to analyze concepts, particularly when you start with a foundation of full removal or partial removal. And then if you go partial removal, repurposing, or keeping it completely in place and repurposing it. Now, if we get, after going through that decision-making framework, and we get to a point where our commission and potentially other regulatory agencies weigh in and say, we want to repurpose this in full or in partial in some form, then our options become much more of a traditional leasing management agency. And so we either receive applications in a reactive kind of mode, or we go out for an RFP. So that's conceptually how we might approach this. Again, we're still working through a lot of these details as we speak, and all of our thought process and our evolution and our thinking is always informed by our interaction in forums like this and our town hall events and individual conversations that we have with stakeholders. But that's a little insight into how we're thinking about this moving forward. I hope that helps.
We've had a very intensive forum, I think, and we've got an awful lot of information. The challenge is going to be to try to structure this information so that there will be some key messages that will emerge that will be helpful to this process. So in closing, I would like each of you to make a comment. I think everyone in this room wants to have an inclusive, transparent process that produces the best decision for each platform, best for the ocean and best for society. And I realize best, we each have our own set of lenses that we look through. But if there were one thing that you would like to take away from this forum that would be helpful in help you in making those decisions, who wants to start? Just one thing that we could do, all of us, that would help in this process. Cassidy, go.
I guess I'll start. As someone that may be tasked with reviewing one of these proposals and developing a recommendation for our commission about, what they should authorize, what I've found in past efforts to be most helpful and productive for my work is having informed stakeholders. And so I'd really task you all with that, really trying to educate yourself in this space so that when you do weigh in to the State Lands Commission or the Coastal Commission or to Bessie about what you feel like they should do, you're coming from a space of understanding their regulations, their legal constraints, and kind of speaking in the appropriate language. So that when you're advocating for your position, it's done in a way that can be received in the most productive way by the regulators that need to make those decisions.
Who wants to go next? Go ahead.
So I just think this informational forum is just really key, and it continues with this individual decommissioning working group because the conversations continue to go, and that's what really kind of feeds into this. And really what will come from it will be the preparation of the environmental document, the EIR for Holly, EIS EIRs for the federal activities. And I think just participation in that, there's so much participation opportunities. There's the notice of procedures, which we didn't really talk about, and it's regulatory, where it allows for public involvement early on to scope out some of these alternatives. It's not just the regulatory environment coming up with what they think is best. They then share that before the document's even prepared and open up to the community and say, look, what do you guys think? And that gives just other opportunities, and it's just a constant participation. And for Santa Barbara County, we see this a lot because we really have a high level of participation, and it's trying to keep informed, because some of the suggestions you think of and go, oh my gosh, I'm not really sure how we could even contemplate that. But it's still listening to those and having other people listen to other people speak at meetings. And really what it comes down to will be the informational document. That's what brings together the public input, the scientific approach, and that's what will inform all the regulatory environments, because there is a heavy regulatory environment, as we all know, in California. But ultimately, all these agencies have to rely on something to make a decision, and it's the CEQA document that they'll rely on. And so really continuing these discussions and moving them forward so that the documents that are presented to decision makers are really the best ones and have been well thought out and well discussed is really what will be helpful, I think.
Bob?
Thought of your question in a different way. I get back to Dr. Jenny. Yeah, really demonstrate that we're serious about going green and getting away from fossil fuels. And that to me would send the message to the agencies that as part of that, yeah, we want to know what's the right remedy for handling these previous issues of offshore drilling and now getting that out of the ocean. What's the best way of doing that? So go green, go blue economy. I guess that's simple.
Jennifer?
I would just, in addition to everything that my colleagues up here have said, I would add that we all approach this issue with an open mind and with a desire to learn and understand different perspectives, because I get, especially being in a position where we do have to make recommendations to our decision makers, when the choices become do reefing or don't do reefing, leave it in place or take it full out, when there are binary choices, then it really hampers and restricts creative solutions and thought processes that would lead us in that way. And we all know how complex our marine environment is, and binary choices aren't going to get us where we need to go. And so we have to be creative, we have to seek to understand, and that will lead us to creativity.
Good point. So, Don, you get to give the benediction.
I don't know. It strikes me. One time I was working with Sempra, and a gentleman said that there's three basic things we need as a society. We need food, we need water, and we need energy. And I keep reflecting back in my role, not only as a biologist, but as just a human, and the contribution I make day in and day out to the problems we have right now. When I was born, there was 2.5 billion people on this planet. And when I was in high school, we put a guy on the moon, and he took a picture back looking at the Earth, and there's this little blue marble in the middle of all this blackness. And the environmental movement was born because we realized this is all we got, guys. This is it. And now there's, 7.5 billion of us on this planet? We can't think about just what we do in California. We need to do in California, demonstrate what we can do for the world, and the examples we can lay out. And there's another 2.5 billion people coming. We're already stressed on water. We're already stressed on food, and the efficiencies that we make in energy hopefully will lower our need per unit or per capita. And then we'll find renewable sources to replace those. I just think all of us have to be conscious of the idea that we're all contributors to the problem. It's not just the oil companies. It's not just the guys in India or the Chinese or something. We're all collectively part of this. And if we show people a better way to do it, that better way will be cheaper and more efficient and the more sustainable way to go. So some of these solutions aren't about costing more money. They're actually about saving money. And I think if we get creative, we're in the technological center of the planet, for crying out loud. This is where bioengineering goes on. This is where electronics are being developed. This is the food capital of the world. We have the 5th greatest economy in the world. And we need to put our expertise, the reports we've gotten from the scientists that demonstrate the value of these things, these platforms, I think is really valuable to contributing to the conversation about what to do with them. At the same time, we have a lot more problems to solve, and I think science has a role in that, but all of us have a responsibility to interpret it properly so the right decisions for the regulators that are represented here can be made.
I think it's a lot of good advice right there, and a lot of it focuses on being informed, being educated, and also understanding how complex these problems are, and simple binary choices don't get us to where we really need to be. And we need to think, I think California can be this example for the rest of the world. We have all the ingredients if we can just harness those. So I want to thank all 5 of you. I want to thank all of our speakers over the last 2.5 days, our panelists. I want to thank our partners, the State Lands Commission, the Ocean Protection Council, the Coastal Commission, Dr. Allen and Charlotte Ginsberg, and the Honda Marine Science Foundation, and also from the Aquarium Marine Science Research Institute. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.